Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Do we all know each other? Maybe Bill or whoever's, I think we all know each other, but if there's any need to do introductions, Bill and Jared, I leave it to you guys to lead us.
Do we maybe just want to just very quickly state names for everyone who's here?
Name, title, particularly for staff, yeah.
All right, I guess I can just kick us off. I'm Jared Shaw, Workforce Policy Analyst and Grant Manager with YDD.
My name is Bill Hansell. I am a Youth Policy Analyst and researcher, data guy, youth advocate as well.
All right, and I'm Paul Sell. I'm the Re-Engagement Systems Manager, and as Bill said, I'm kind of a versatile player on this, so I dabble in a lot of things within YDD, but glad to have everybody on board today.
I'm Brian Detman, YDD Director. Celeste, I want to kick it to you so we can keep this moving.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. I didn't know where I would land. I'm glad I'm here with you all. It's nice to be here. I also am appreciating all of these great virtual backgrounds. And let me see, John, I'll kick it to you.
John Teague, Chief of Police, City of Kaiser. I noticed that we're all the old timers on here. Janet and John and Alicia and Jaime.
That's a great beard, Chief Teague.
I'm trying, inspired by Bill and further inspired by Jared here, man.
Hi, it's Janet. So I'm the former executive director for the Oregon Alliance of Children's Programs, and that was a organization I worked at for over 20 years that addressed the needs of kiddos across all of the spectrums, that most of which are included in the YDC. And I'm retired and thank you, Jaime. I'm reflecting. But one of the things that's terrific about the YDC is going to Chief's comments to get to be able to sort of recycle some of the things that we've learned in the past that can be morphed into the goals and objectives that we have today and going forward.
I could go next as another senior member of the YDC. Just strange to say that, but so fortunate to be with y'all, especially through this past year. Let's say I live in Salem. I'm in my daughter's room. I took over. It's my office for the moment until she kicks me out. And yeah, I work for a nonprofit and do a lot of community building work. Who's left? Alicia. Alicia's also with us.
Hey, good morning. I'm Alicia Hayes. I like the retirement part, Janet. I'm not reflecting as much as I should. Went back, was retired from Director of Health and Human Services and recently went back to work on the COVID response. So been busy doing that. Finished that up with a couple of large, working on those clinics, and member of the school board for J down in Eugene. But right now I'm sitting in Arizona, enjoying being with you and looking at the sun. So who was left?
Somebody's, it's Paul who's on the phone, right? So I think that's everybody. All right, Bill and Jared and Paul.
All right, well, I'll kick us off and just want to say that this is very much a team effort between Jared, myself, and Paul. I'll be taking the lead on the presentation for the PowerPoint section, but all three of us are available to answer questions. The intent is that it's conversational, so please feel free at any point as questions come up during the presentation to ask them, and time permitting, we will also have a general discussion period after the slide presentations. I am now sharing my screen. And as many people know, this gets a little bit odd because I can't see what you're seeing. So I hope, yeah, that this presentation is titled Beyond Graduation Rates from Data to Policy. And it's the intent is to show how data that is often interpreted one way or used a certain way can be looked at perhaps on the flip side or a different way, and reflects how we use data to influence both practice and policy. I have to figure out how to advance my slide. Very good. So in setting the stage, back in the graduating class of 2013, some of you will remember this, Oregon had a graduation rate of 68.66, which was, of all the states in the nation that reported, which turns out it was 49, Oregon was 49th, worst in the nation. By comparison, the class of 2020 had the highest four-year graduation rate in the history of the state. We don't know yet relatively where it ranks in the nation, but for the state, it was the record. So in 8 graduating classes, that was a 14% increase in the graduation rate between the two cohorts. And as you might recall, the headlines were very different as those were announced in the media. But what does this mean for YDD, YDC? Higher graduation rates. And who is a graduate? How are GED earners counted? And just what is a 4-year or 5-year adjusted cohort anyway? So to cover a few of those bases to help us understand the data better, Oregon uses, and it's a national model, it's conformed to the best they're able across the state, but they use what's called a cohort graduation and completer rate. And technically, it's actually the adjusted cohort. A cohort is a group of students determined by high school entry year. It can be thought of as being very similar to what we would refer to, like I was the class of 88. I'll date myself, but it's similar to that notion, except it's based on when you first enter high school, your first year of high school, and then they follow that through. And for most, 90+% of everybody, that's your freshman year. So it tracks along. The cohort just follows one class through their 4 years or 5 years of high school. The adjusted cohort means that they have, as this is being followed, removed youth that, the most obvious one and saddest one is that pass away. They would be removed from the cohort. Unfortunately, that's the easiest way to be removed from the cohort. But another common one is movement out of state. That would get you out of the cohort. But otherwise, every public school student is counted in that cohort. The graduation rate is calculated by determining the percentage of students that graduate within a given time frame. And ODE publishes 4- and 5-year graduation and completer rates. But that begs the question, what is a graduate? ODE defines a graduate as a student who has received a standard diploma, and those standard diplomas are considered to be the Oregon diploma, which is the typical 24-credit diploma, the youth participating in the postgraduate scholar program, which means they have earned their diploma, and or earning a modified diploma, which the other definition they use are completers, and completers are students who have received a standard diploma. So they include all graduates as well, and or an additional credential, which is defined as an adult high school diploma, an extended diploma, or GED. So if you earn a GED, you are considered a completer, but not a graduate. Unless you earn, it's possible to earn your GED and then complete high school, in which case you would be considered a graduate.
Bill,
Yes.
could I ask just a quick question?
Oh, please.
Because we look at students who sometimes sit at the intersection of justice. I'm curious about the adjusted cohort and who is included or not included in that when we think about students that are involved with the justice system.
That is an excellent question. And my understanding, as long as their requirements to provide education, even within those settings. And so as long as they're within that, your cohort is determined, and then if you're receiving public education, even if they, so basically they are counted in the cohort. Institutionalized youth are not removed from the cohort, is my understanding.
Okay, thanks.
And
Bill,
go ahead.
That's my understanding as well, is that they're tied to that general population.
And so for kids who are in out-of-home care, so they're not in a building, but they're receiving education services, and those are included in the cohort?
As long as it's considered public education. So the state will not count if you're in a private setting, right? Like if you're going to Jesuit in Portland, right? The state doesn't count you because you're a private school student, and the state isn't in the business of counting private school students.
I guess I'm talking about kids who would be in behavioral health or transitional service settings where they're going to be living there, and they're going to receive education services, but those services often don't look like classroom services. So are those kids included, or?
So basically your behavioral, there's nothing about your status that removes you from the cohort, except if you move out of state, transfer to a private school, or pass away. Basically, those are the only three ways that you cannot be included or never show up to high school to begin with, right? Like, so those kids are never in that count either. But it's independent of where you live, how you're receiving your education. So like, for example, wards of the foster youth, they're all counted in the cohort.
Foster youth are generally in a public school setting if they're attending school. So, but if you've got somebody at, Babaloni or at Trillium or other places where kids are living, and they either hire their own teachers or public school teachers come into classroom settings, but they're not day-long teaching settings. They're actually a lot like what kids are doing now, where they would get a limited number of hours of tutoring during the week, like maybe even an hour a day, and then the rest of the time would be self-selected or supervised online learning.
Yeah, so that's a good technical area. It would really depend, were they ever in high school? Because if they had ever attended high school at any point, their cohort is set. And then if they leave that and go to like Children's Farm Home or Janus, a private treatment center or community-based one, they're still in the cohort, because once you were counted in it, unless you provide documentation of a transfer or something like that, you're always in it. In fact, even youth that pass away, if the proper paperwork doesn't come through, they're counted in the cohort. And actually, Oregon has one of the most rigorous definitions of that, which is also why it contributed to a low graduation rate initially, because it had one of the most rigorous definitions. For example, at the same time, Texas had a category that was moved, returned to home country, or something like that. And so any kid that was particularly of Hispanic Latino descent that they lost track of or didn't know what happened to, they would mark them as returned to home country, and that would remove them from the calculation, which would then inflate their graduation rate, right? In Oregon, all those youth that weren't counted by Texas would have been counted in our calculation.
And just a quick follow-up question, this might be part of your, if I would stop asking, have you broken out the cohorts?
Yes. Yep. Stay tuned. So Paul, did you have something?
I would say, so Jeanette, the couple of things that I've seen in the K-12 system, so like the tutoring piece that you're talking about, where some of the residential programs contract with school districts to tutor, they're still counted in the cohort. They're actually still the students of that district. And then some of the other more private residential facilities, depends on how their education is set up, whether it's a private piece or contracted through other services. Being alternative ed, we had incarcerated youth that would access our online system, and so they would be tied back to the district itself. So there's a lot of different models out there, but typically they would stay into those cohorts, especially if they're still tied with that district. And then if they withdraw from that district and move into another district, then the cohort would still remain the same. They should be tied with the other district within that system. Some of the ESD programs also offer that same type of education.
So thank you. A few more nuances. The 4-year adjusted cohort rate is the percentage of students that are counted as graduates within the 4 years. The 4-year adjusted cohort completer rate is the percentage of students that are counted as completers within the adjusted cohort over 4 years. Since all graduates are also completers, the completer rate will always be higher than the graduation rate. So it would be, I can't think of a situation that would arise where it would be lower. Similarly, the 5-year adjusted cohorts include all of the outcomes from the 4-year adjusted cohort in that count, because there's, unlike say as a 10th grader, you were able to test out of 11th grade and you bump to 12th grade, that changes your graduating class, right? You're graduating now a year earlier than you would have otherwise, but your cohort year remains the same. So that there's a little bit of difference there.
Hey, Bill, I'm just giving you guys a time check.
Okay.
You got about 5 minutes or so.
The YDD is particularly interested in the 5-year adjusted cohort completer rate, because if a student is not a 5-year completer rate, it is most likely that they will not finish high school, partially because ODE only counts to 5 years, and there's really no way to get those kids even counted back on the books. ODE itself does not calculate a rate or give this student group a name. The YDD calculates a 5-year adjusted cohort non-completer rate. also like to call that non-completer rate other than completer. It just means these are the group of kids that have earned, that are not counted as completers or graduates. So a non-completer rate is a youth in the adjusted cohort that is not counted as a completer and or graduate. Non-completer rate, percentage of youth in the adjusted cohort who are not counted as completers. I want to make this clear because you won't find this in any of ODE's published data. I have to, or we have to extract this from publicly available data to calculate these rates. Here is the 5-year non-completer rate over the last 5 cohorts. And all students here is the actual, what we'd call N size or population size. So in the most recent 5-year adjusted cohort, there were 46,000 plus youth, and the 5-year completion rate was 87.1%. That means the non-completer rate was 12.79%, and 5,900 students did not complete. As we look at these across the years, you can see that much like the graduation rate, there have been reductions. Back in the class of 2016, there were 8,000 non-completers after 5 years, and that has moved to approximately 6,000. So just by glancing at that, the average is going to be somewhere in the 6,000 students per cohort do not complete high school.
Hey, Bill, just
Yes.
so I'm much better at explaining who is part of that cohort that graduates than explaining the 20%, right, from the last report that didn't graduate. And that's where I have trouble sort of simplifying who are these 20%.
Yes. Great segue. Here, these are, and it's not quite 20% because of that completer pool, right? So you have your 4-year graduate, you have graduates, you have completers, and you have other than or non-completers. And so the 82% highest ever graduation rate doesn't mean that 18% didn't complete high school. It means that 18% didn't graduate in 4 years. Now, this is the population of youth that did not complete after 5 years, based by all the published student groups. You can see down here, here's our 46,000 again. Here's our 5,901. This reflects this section of the most recent one. And I've calculated a relative risk indicator. Now, this is where we look at equity and disproportionality. I have ranked it by relative risk. So if you're in the combined disadvantage group, which is comprises underserved race ethnicities, and are it's a composite measure of poverty, underserved race ethnicities. I just forgot some of them, I think homeless students, but you can see they are 3 times. That's what the relative risk indicator means. If a 1 is you're at even odds, there's no you're not more likely or less likely to be in the non-completer group because of your student group status. So for example, here, combined disadvantage, it means you're 3 times more likely not to complete high school. Homeless students are 2.85 times not as likely to complete high school. When you start getting down, you see that our race ethnicity groups begin with American Indian, Alaskan Native, and Black and African American, and they are both approximately 1.5 times more likely to not complete. At the end, as you would expect, talented and gifted students are positively associated with, that's almost 100% likely to not be a completer, a non-completer. And so when you start looking at what's below the 1 mark, we have multiracial, never English learners, white, former English learners. You can see the list there. So, and this then is also the actual population size of that group. So how many Black African Americans were in the cohort, the most recent cohort? 1,163 students out of the 46,000. And 227 of those students did not complete high school. That's how those numbers work. So you can see, in terms of relative size, because it's a combined, composite, there are a lot of students in the combined disadvantage. Then you'd expect 50% to be male and 50% to be female. And that's about what it is. So any questions about these numbers?
Bill, I'm really confused about the never English learners. It's a really large number. It's, more than 4,500. And it looks like they're more likely to graduate with a relative risk. Whereas the English learners anytime in high school has a much more likely. Can you help me understand the never English learners?
Yes, that would be English as your only language. So that would be
got it. Okay.
Anybody that didn't have to learn English. So
Okay.
if it's basically saying if English is your native language. So you can see why that's so high, because it effectively is the just for a comparison, I'm going to look at the white group, which is 3,379, and then the never English learners. And you can see that just by comparing them there, that means there's about 1,300 youth that are pulled from other race ethnicity groups than white, that are not, that English was their primary language. Just a way to look at it. Now, your English learners anytime in high school are those that had not left the English learner categorization before they entered high school. And you'll see here that there's another category of former English learners, and they have a much lower graduation rate. So if those youth moved out of the English learner category, they have actually even better outcomes than native English speakers, or less risk of being a non-completer than your native English speakers. And there's a lot to unpack there about why this indicator, is so strong. But it's basically suggests that if you're still learning English by the time you get to high school, it suggests you have increased risk for not completing, and or the school district or school is potentially resistant to moving youth out of that category. This is an unintended consequence thing. There's more money distributed as part of the ADM for youth that are categorized, which creates a disincentive for some school districts to focus on moving non-English remediating that English deficit.
Hey, Bill, point of
Yes.
clarification.
Yes.
So the English language learners anytime in high school as well, I believe, is the newcomers. So youth that are entering into high school and needing ESL services. So they're coming into the school system at a high school age and receiving ELL services. So it's not just if they didn't meet prior. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah. So for example, if a student from Africa moved in as a 10th grader, they would be an English learner anytime in high school. Same thing if somebody started in 6th grade and was tested and needed the, classification as your English learner program, and they hadn't left that program by the time they got to high school, and so they're still considered English language learners in high school, they also are that meet that definition. So it can be that you move into high school as an English learner, or it can be that you're still basically, this isn't the right terminology, but it's the way to think of it. They haven't yet tested out of being an English learner by the time they got to high school.
So Bill, it sounds like we're gonna lose some time here. So can you tell us what the key points are between 2013 and 2020 graduation rates?
Yeah.
So what happened?
So the point of this is, and thanks Janet for bringing it, is that we still have, even with the best graduation rate that Oregon has ever achieved, nearly 6,000 youth per cohort that are not completing high school. And there is a strong degree of disproportionality as well among those non-completers. In fact, the disproportionality among non-completers is the most disproportionate of any of the other achievement gap areas. And so when this notion of looking at the data and the headlines talk about highest graduation rate ever, right? Like there's still policy work to be done. What's happening? We can't increase, if you the pool of your completers is approximately 2,000 youth, right? Compared to the 6,000 youth, right? So we're reaching a point where there is no other way to increase our graduation rate unless we bring back these youth, right? And this is really how we use data to inform our population. Who are we targeting, type of thing. Like how do we organize around some of the other statistics that are like related to crime. You're 3 times more likely to go to be incarcerated if you don't complete high school. The life course trajectories between completers and non-completers are much different than between high school graduates and completers. I like to say the difference between a high school graduate and a completer, there's no difference if they both go to college. Any difference is completely eradicated by attending college. But if they don't, it's like the difference in annual earning between a Mercedes and a VW. That's the difference between a graduate and a completer. The difference between a completer and a non-completer is time behind bars, right? That's a world of difference between a Mercedes and a VW. So that is just an example of the type of data that we use to support why a re-engagement system is necessary, or very similar to the risk principle that was presented in yesterday's thing. This is the highest need group, but it also means that when you deliver interventions to this group, you receive the highest return on your investment. And if if there's somebody keeping track of time, now this is the portion of just would love to see what the council thought this type of data implied for our work, and any other questions or ideas for whatever remaining time we have.
Bill, just to add on to some of the pieces about where this data is showing, we had talked in prepping for this, is that non-completer rate is one of those areas where we see an increase in graduation rate, but which may come off of a 5th-year completer rate, but that non-completer rate, it doesn't grow as fast as the graduation rate. Did you want to talk a little bit about that, if there weren't some questions?
Yes. Yeah, I can. This one shows that when you look at the cohort size, it's remarkably stable over five years. There's approximately and pretty consistently 46,000 some odd students per cohort. And the size of what's not immediately, obviously, to get to a higher graduation rate, then you would have to have more graduates as a proportion of that. You can see that there is the relative size of the pool. Oops.
Bill and Paul, sorry to interrupt. I don't know if you saw a message from Melissa. I think we have all new participants in our room right now. Is that?
Oh.
Yeah.
I think we are supposed to be going into the new rooms. Yes.
Okay. Well, let's start from the beginning.
Start again. Welcome, everybody.
I saw new faces and blank stares, so I was like, what happened? But thanks for that clarification. Let's do a real quick, we did this last time, introduction. My name is Bill Hansell. I'm a youth advocate, youth policy analyst, and particularly around analyzing data and doing research, and then using that to inform policy decisions.
Everybody, my name is Jared Shaw. I'm workforce policy analyst and grant manager with YDD.
Hi, everybody. I'm Paul Sell. I'm the re-engagement systems manager for YDD.
And I don't know if everyone wants to just do very quick names and titles.
Hi, I'm Christina McMahon. I'm the Clackamas County Juvenile Department Director.
Hi, everybody. My name is Ephra, and I work for the Boys and Girls Club here in Salem for their Training Teens for Tomorrow Workforce Readiness Program.
Liz or Diana? I guess we can see everyone, so.
Hey there, Diana Rojas, she, her, and I'm a youth council member.
Hi there, Liz Thorne, she, her. I'm Director of Matchstick Consulting and a council member.
One thing, are you seeing the PowerPoint presentation as well? Okay, didn't want to make sure that carried over. A little, as we start, this is intended to be an open discussion, so please feel free to ask questions at any point. There will also be a general discussion time permitting at the end. The intent of this presentation is to show one example of of an analysis of the data that may inform, and we're looking specifically at graduation rates, but beyond graduation rates, from data to policy, how this is used, put into policy and practice. In 2013, Oregon had the lowest graduation rate of any reporting state in the nation. It was 68.66%. You might have heard about this. There was a lot of news, worst graduation rate in the nation. By comparison, the most recent data from the class of 2020, the graduation rate was 82.63%. That is a 14-point increase over the 8 graduating classes, technically the 4-year adjusted cohort graduation rate, which we will go into. As you might recall, the headlines were very different between these two graduation rates. But what does this mean for the YDD, YDC? Is there a difference in our work because we have a high graduation rate versus a low graduation rate? And who is counted as a graduate? How are GED earners counted? And just what is a 4 or 5 year cohort, adjusted cohort anyway? So to lay a few of these principles down, or a few of these definitions, a cohort is a group of students that's tracked over 4 years or 5 years based on their high school entry year. It's slightly different than what we consider to be, like, I'm class of 88, right? Like, it's slightly different than that, because if I were to have, tested out of my 10th grade year, I would have been graduating in the class of 87. However, my high school entry year didn't change, so I would still be in the cohort that's associated with the graduating class of 88. So they're slightly different, but you can conceive of them as the same class of whatever. The adjusted cohort is basically adjusting the cohort for youth that have, the most obvious one is passed away, right? Like they're no longer counted. If you die, you're no longer counted in the cohort. And unfortunately, that's the easiest way to get removed from the cohort. Part of what contributed to Oregon's low graduation rate initially was that it has a very rigorous definition, and it's very hard to be removed from the cohort. But outside of passing away, the most other common one is moving out of state with documentation that you have enrolled in a new school in another state. That would also remove you from the that's part of the adjustment for the cohort. The graduation rate is simply the percentage of those students that are counted as graduates in the 4 or 5 years. And a graduate, by definition of ODE, is an earner of an Oregon diploma, a postgraduate scholar, or a modified diploma. Now, completers include all graduates as well as those that earned a credential such as an adult high school diploma, an extended diploma, or GED. So if you earn a GED, you're a completer, but you're not a graduate. If you earn an Oregon diploma, you are both a completer and a graduate. Because of this, the 5-year adjusted cohort rate for completers and graduates will always be higher than the 4-year rates because they include all of the 4-year outcomes. The 4-year completer rate will always be higher than the 4-year graduation rate because it includes all graduates in its definition. The 5-year adjusted cohort graduation are calculated the same as the 4-year, just over 5 years. And the YDD and YDC is particularly interested in this 5-year adjusted cohort, because if a student does not complete after 5 years, one, ODE doesn't even count after that, which then indicates and is also bearing out that these are what would be the youth that do not complete high school. So, we're looking at graduation rates, and instead of information about the graduates, we have now arrived at a population that is not completing high school. And just as a point of clarification, ODE does not calculate a non-completer rate or give the student group a name, which is interesting. The YDD, then we have to do it. We calculate a 5-year adjusted cohort non-completer rate. I also like to refer to them as other than completer, but that's a little bit harder to roll out. So think of non-completer as the same thing as you didn't earn other than completer. With that said, the way we calculate the non-completer rate is a youth in the adjusted cohort that is not counted as a completer. Non-completer rate, percentage of youth in the adjusted cohort who are not counted as completers. Again, ODE does not publish this data, but here it is. Here are 5 years of the most recent 5-year cohort data. What you can see here is that this row is the all students for the category. So in the class of 2020, there were 46,100 and change students. And the 5-year completer rate was 87.21. So if you remember, the 4-year graduation rate was 82. And I didn't show it, but the 4-year completer rate is 85%. That means in the 5th year, they picked up 2%. So the non-completer pool of those 46,000, nearly 6,000 did not complete after 5 years. And that's a rate of 12.79%. You can see that the adjusted cohort is relatively stable, actually remarkably stable, within, for most of them, within about 80 students. So it's your cohort rate's very stable. You can see that the non-completers went from, in the class of 16, were numbered at 8,000 and dropped to 6,000. That is not as, you can see that this is a 6-point change, 18% to 12%, as opposed to the 14% change in the graduation rate, right? So I hope this is showing how we're building the case that, hey, our youth that are not completing high school is not the same proportionate as the rate of increase in our graduation rate, right? It is going down, but not at the same rate as our graduation rate is going up. This has implications because our non-completer population has the most disparity among any of the achievement gap indicators. What I have done here is calculate what's called a relative risk indicator, and I have ranked it by highest to lowest. This is the population size for the student group, and in the adjusted cohort, and then of the adjusted cohort that are non-completers. A relative risk indicator of 1 is neutral. You're neither more likely or less likely to not complete high school. Anything under a 1 is a less likely to be a non-completer. Anything over a 1 is you're more likely to be a non-completer. So combined disadvantage, which is a composite measure of underserved race ethnicities, free and reduced price lunch, basically all the negative indicators you can see is 3 times more likely. So if you have it's same kind of notion of compound trauma idea. If you're in several of these categories that equal combined disadvantage, you're 3 times more likely to not complete high school. Homeless students, 2.85 times not as likely to complete in 5 years. As you get down, the first race ethnicity groups that we see are African American and American Indian, and they are a little over 1.5 times more likely to not complete high school. So as we struggle with equity and across the board and are working to make those improvements, the point is that you can show gains in the graduation rate that indicate less disparity in the graduation outcome, but the disparity remains and can in fact increase in your non-completer pool. For example, an example of policy, if you're looking only at the 4-year graduation rate, is to move students out of the completer pool, because there's graduates, completers, and non-completers. And so if you develop a policy that tries to get your completers to bump into graduates, for some students that isn't going to work. And if they don't have that option to be a completer, they become a non-completer. So the graduation rate can go up at the same time the non-completer rate goes up, and the non-completer rate going up can be thought of as actually doing harm. I like to talk about the difference between graduates and completers. Are first of all, if a completer and a graduate both go to college, any difference is ameliorated by going to college. There is doesn't matter how you get to college. Once you get to college, the difference between your credential is wiped out. But if you don't go to college, type of thing, the difference between a graduate and a completer is like driving a Mercedes for the graduate versus a VW for the completer. The difference between completers and non-completers is time behind bars, increased likelihood of substance abuse, increased likelihood of interpersonal violence, completely different life course trajectories, not the difference between a Mercedes and a VW, the difference between being incarcerated or not. So that it's a significant difference. And this is how we, for example, are analyzing data in a different light than what ODE does. They don't even publish this, right? I don't think they're trying to hide it. They just, their focus is different. Any questions? All right. Moving on then, it's kind of like, as council members, what does this type of analysis of the data or like, have you seen the data presented this way before? What do you see as implications for the work of the YDC based on data analysis like this, and how can we use that in from part of this as example is this is the type of data that we use to drive our lobbying efforts, our engagement efforts for the need for re-engagement, which then resulted in policy change and hopefully and we'll begin, Paul can speak to this, change in practice. Go ahead, Liz.
Yeah, I think just a couple of observations. And when you asked, have you seen the data presented this way? I think I've seen it in different slices, but not in sort of like such stark contrast to what we see and hear and read about with the graduation rate. So I appreciate that distinction. And I think when you said that you can raise the graduation rate and see disparities go down in graduation, but you could not see an equal decrease in the non-completer rate and actually see disparities widen, I think that is something to elevate like loudly. And then the other thing that I noticed, like one of the things that is most protective, if that's the right word, lessens the relative risk is participation in a CTE program. So I think that's just something that stood out to me. And I think that just, again, speaks to like the work around re-engagement and career and technical education and just the vast service that does for young people. So those were the two things that were swirling in my head. But I think your question of like, how do these data drive the policy, I think is exactly the conversation to be had. So thanks for sharing it.
Thank you, Liz. Oh, go ahead.
Hi, Bill, this strikes, can you guys hear me okay? Okay,
Yes.
I have a very old building that I work out of, and if I have the heater on and try to do a Zoom meeting, I can't hear people usually, so bear with me. But it's really cold up here. This is striking me on many levels. So seeing it presented this way is, my brain is just firing in a lot of directions. I have a lot of folks on my team that I want to talk to about it, especially my research folks that do our data analysis. Yesterday, we had that great presentation from Juliet Mackin about the juvenile crime prevention risk assessment, which is made up of domains with different risk factors. So I wrote a note to myself that I want to take a look at this and see when we look at our risk assessment scores for kids, and then we break it down by the domains that we see, the education domain, I want to see, obviously all those risk factors lead to what the risk level is, high, medium, or low risk to reoffend and commit another juvenile crime. So I want to take a look at the interplay between those risk factors and risk scores with what we're seeing here. And then this is broken down with different racial groups, and we do have access to data through our juvenile justice information system. I was just in the other session with Sanji, and she was sharing that information. I think that we need to take a look at that, the overlay of that. And then lastly, through the juvenile justice information system, we get the recidivism rates, and they're broken down by, another offense. So that's, regular recidivism. And then we have something called chronic recidivism, which are the kids who tend to be higher risk, and they reoffend at least 3 or more times in a subsequent year. That is a very concerning group because they end up typically committing the most crimes as a subset in the community. So I want to drill down and see what it says about what we know about their completion and graduation rates, if we can get that information, because I think that there is some very compelling intersectionalities here that could really tell the story of how critical graduation is if we looked at it from the lens of those different intersections. So just a few ideas. I know when I speak to my certifiable smart data analysis research people, they will probably have all kinds of other thoughts on it, but this to me is very exciting.
Well, Christina, I was trained by Dr. Latessa, who is the originator of much of the work that was done on the JCP assessment. My PhD work was done at the University of Cincinnati in their criminology department. Criminologists, unfortunately, have a much stronger awareness of what it means to not complete high school in terms of life course trajectory than educators typically do. Because as you know, the #1 predictor of future criminality besides present criminality is not completing high school. That's the biggest single indicator. If that youth that you're assessing isn't in high school, isn't, that's the, how that it's a big predictor. And so in many ways that I worked backwards from formulating that type of thing of let's look at the youth that aren't completing high school, because unlike some of these survey, you know, American Community Survey or other data. These are actual youth, right? We have every data point on them that ODE collects. We don't have to guess what this population looks like. We know, right? We don't have to sample just a portion of the population. We have the bulk of the population. But I like those points. One thing that is fascinating to me that was brought up in the last one by people is you look at English learner anytime in high school, 2.45 times as likely to not complete high school. However, when you look at former English learners, they have a lower relative risk than native English speakers, right? And so this is the type of thing, there's something going on there. You know, like, I don't know what it is yet because haven't followed it up yet, but just based on this, I can say that there's something worth investigating there, because it appears that if you're an English learner and you test out or are able to be removed from that category prior to getting to high school, you're actually less likely to not complete high school than an English speaker is. But if you're not ever removed, or if you come to high school as an English learner, you have one of the highest likelihoods of not completing. So what's happening in our, you know, what's driving, like, first of all, why aren't some youth being removed from that categorization? And then it would also speak to, we need more intensive more intensive English learning for high school students, right? Or something like, right? Like, this is a way to, you know, develop a policy agenda that may have big implications down the road, because if we can lessen, you know, lessen that group, get them, you know, again, just looking at this data that I hadn't thought about before, just off the spot. So, Tavita, you joined us late. Do you have any questions or anything I can help catch up on?
Yeah, please forgive me. I got caught up in a meeting. So I have a couple of questions, and it's probably, you know, I know the answer is, you know, even if you know, no question is a dumb question, and I know I'm a little late here. So the first is, you have the gender breakdown for some groups and not, and in some places not. And I'm curious about that. So for example, I'm imagining that, I'm just gonna say for, you know, African-American, Black African-Americans, that the female rates of graduation are higher than the males. And, you know, are we just getting this generalization? I mean, you know, I know this is, I mean, I know we're doing deficit language because we're just trying to see what's not working. But same thing with the Asian Pacific Islander students. We see I think, is it right? Female, but not male. Is that right? Or is that the white students?
It's interesting because there are differences among the race ethnicity groups in terms of gender. Some are better and some are, you know, typically though, it's as represented, as you can see here, males versus females. And that tends to hold across the groups, but there are some populations. And to your point, yes, we can, because this is aggregated individual level data, we can break that down further. So I can tell you CTE participants by gender. I can tell you CTE participants by any of these race ethnicity categories.
Yeah,
That type
I
of
think
thing.
that's helpful for me because when
Yeah.
to just throw that kind of dynamic out there, we want to really target this, right? And then you talked about your analysis with the English learners anytime. Are you talking about, is this white students or just across the board?
So
doing better, doing worse than those who are former English learners?
Yes, this category here, oops, keep doing that. Never English learner is just an odd title, right? I don't know where they got that, but that means English is your primary language. You don't have to be white, obviously, for English to be your primary language, but in Oregon, that's how the numbers would play out. And so this would have a strong correlation with white, and you can see the numbers here, but it's not quite the same. So